In Thailand, there is a tradition older than memory. Before a champion fights his scheduled opponent, he sometimes challenges the crowd. Anyone. No rank required, no name needed. It is called the open call, a ritual humiliation disguised as generosity, designed to remind everyone watching exactly how far the gap is between a champion and an ordinary man. In 30 years, nobody had ever answered the open call and walked away standing, until a foreign tourist in the cheap seats raised his hand. The champion didn't recognize him. Why would he? The man was wearing a plain gray t-shirt, sitting in the second-to-last row, eating from a paper container of noodles when the call went out. The translator who relayed the challenge to him later said the foreigner didn't even finish his bite before nodding. Nobody in that stadium that night knew his name. They would never forget his face. To understand what happened that night, you first need to understand what the open call actually was. Muay Thai stadium culture in the 1970s operated on principles that most Western combat sports had never developed and would have struggled to justify if they had. Before the main events, the scheduled, sanctioned bouts between ranked fighters, certain stadiums maintained an older tradition, a holdover from the art's village origins, when challenges were issued openly and settled in front of whoever happened to be watching. The open call was theater, mostly, a way to warm up the crowd, demonstrate a champion's dominance before the real business of the evening began, and remind everyone in the building exactly what they were about to witness at a higher, more refined level once the sanctioned bouts started. It was rarely dangerous for the champion. The men who answered open calls were almost always exactly what they appeared to be: enthusiastic amateurs, drunk tourists, local young men trying to impress a date. The champion would dispatch them in seconds, sometimes with genuine technique, sometimes with a controlled, theatrical flourish designed to entertain rather than injure. Nobody walked away standing. That wasn't cruelty, it was physics. A man who had spent his entire life training in one of the most brutal striking arts on earth, against a volunteer with no training at all, produces exactly one outcome, every time, regardless of how the volunteer feels about his own toughness walking in. The champion that night had been undefeated for 6 years. His name carried weight throughout the Bangkok stadium circuit: 41 professional fights, 41 wins, a striking style built on devastating low kicks, and a clinch game that had broken the will of opponents who were, by any reasonable measure, legitimately dangerous men. He was 28 years old, in the specific physical prime that Muay Thai careers rarely extend much beyond, and he carried himself with the settled, unhurried confidence of a man who had never seriously doubted the outcome of anything that happened inside a ring. He had performed the open call dozens of times. It had become for him almost a formality, a piece of pre-fight choreography rather than a genuine test. He scanned the crowd that night the way he always did, looking for the obvious candidate, the loud one, the drunk one, the young man whose friends were already laughing and recording on whatever device they had, the type who made the open call entertaining rather than merely procedural. His translator pointed toward the back section. A foreigner had raised his hand. Chuck Norris, by the early to mid-1970s, had already won his first World Middleweight Karate Championship and was deep into what would become an unbroken 6-year championship run. He was traveling through Southeast Asia during this period, partly for training purposes, seeking out regional fighting traditions and instructors the way serious martial artists of his generation often did, and partly, on this particular night, simply as a spectator at a stadium event a friend had recommended. He was in his early 30s, lean, conditioned, but dressed in nothing that announced any of it. Plain clothes, the unremarkable presentation of a man who had learned, over years of public competition, that there was no professional advantage to looking dangerous in rooms where danger wasn't currently required. He had watched the early undercard fights with the genuine technical interest of a practitioner studying an unfamiliar style. Muay Thai's clinch work, its low-kick mechanics, the specific conditioning that allowed fighters to absorb leg strikes that would disable an untrained person instantly, all of it was new information, the kind of cross-discipline exposure that Norris actively sought throughout his career, long before cross-training became a standard concept in American martial arts. When the open call was announced, and the translator's explanation made clear what was being offered, Norris understood immediately what he was being invited into. A demonstration, a formality, an entertainment segment that the champion had performed dozens of times with genuine risk. He also understood, with the same clear-eyed assessment he applied to every situation throughout his career, that an unscripted, full-contact engagement against one of the most accomplished strikers in the region was exactly the kind of direct, honest test that no amount of controlled sparring back home could replicate. He raised his hand. The crowd's reaction as Norris made his way down through the bleachers was almost entirely indifferent. This was, after all, exactly what the open call was designed to produce, a procession of volunteers who existed primarily to be defeated entertainingly. Nobody stood up to get a better look, nobody stopped their conversations. A few people glanced toward the aisle with mild curiosity, the way you might glance at anything moving in your peripheral vision, and then return to their drinks and their own conversations. The Champions Corner team, preparing him for the formality, didn't bother adjusting their routine. His trainer wrapped a fresh set of hand wraps around his fists with the efficient, unhurried motion of a man who had done this exact task hundreds of times and saw no reason to treat tonight differently. Norris climbed into the ring without ceremony. He wore what he'd worn into the stadium: simple clothes, no gi, nothing that visually communicated any specific discipline. To anyone watching, he could have been anyone. The translator relayed a few basic ground rules through gestures more than words, the specific limitations Thai stadiums placed on open call exchanges to keep the volunteer segments from accidentally producing real injuries to civilians. Controlled contact, no elbows. The understanding, unspoken but universal, that this was meant to look dangerous without being dangerous. Norris nodded. He stepped to his side of the ring. The champion crossed himself in the traditional Thai manner, touched his gloves to the canvas in a brief, almost absent-minded gesture of respect that had long since become automatic rather than deeply felt for this particular, low-stakes portion of the evening, and turned to face his volunteer opponent. The bell rang for the brief, informal exchange. The champion moved forward with the relaxed, almost performative ease of a man executing a routine he'd executed dozens of times, a probing low kick to test reaction, the standard opening move designed to either land cleanly against an untrained opponent or, at worst, draw a clumsy, ineffective block that would entertain the crowd before the real dismissal began. It did not land cleanly. Norris checked the kick, not with the panicked, instinctive flinch of an untrained man, but with the deliberate, structured defensive motion of someone who had drilled exactly this kind of leg check thousands of times in a different striking discipline. The champion's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, a flicker of genuine attention replacing the routine, distracted confidence he'd carried into the exchange. He adjusted, threw a second kick, faster, testing. Norris moved his structure again, not retreating, not flailing, simply repositioning with the same economical, trained precision that had carried him through 6 consecutive world championships in an entirely different striking system. The crowd, for the first time since the open call began, started paying genuine attention. What happened over the following 90 seconds would become, among the small circle of people who fully understood what they'd seen, one of the most quietly discussed moments in regional martial arts circles for years afterward. Discussed quietly, precisely because almost nobody present understood, in real time, the true significance of what was unfolding in front of them. The champion, now genuinely engaged rather than performing routine, began working his full arsenal: the low kicks that had broken down dozens of legitimate opponents, the clinch entries designed to control distance and set up knee strikes, the specific rhythm of a Muay Thai striker operating at something approaching full capability rather than exhibition pace. Norris absorbed the early pressure with checked kicks and controlled retreats, reading the champion's rhythm the way a serious competitor reads any unfamiliar opponent, gathering information, calibrating timing, identifying patterns before committing to a response. At the 1-minute mark, the champion attempted a clinch entry, stepping inside to control Norris's neck and set up the devastating knee strikes that had ended so many of his professional fights. Norris didn't allow the clinch to fully establish. He used a sharp, structurally efficient redirect, drawing on the same economy of motion principles that Bruce Lee had emphasized in their training together years earlier, to disrupt the champion's entry before his hands could lock into position. The champion stumbled slightly, recovering his balance with the practiced ease of an elite athlete, but the moment registered, genuinely registered. His corner team, watching from ringside, exchanged a brief, uncertain glance, the first sign that this segment of the evening was deviating from its expected script. The champion, now fully serious, increased his pace. A combination, low kick, followed immediately by a body kick aimed at the ribs, the kind of 1-2 sequence that had ended numerous professional bouts by simply breaking an opponent's structural integrity through accumulated impact. Norris checked the kick. The second, faster and aimed higher, he absorbed partially on a raised guard, redirecting most of the force away from center mass, with a defensive technique drawn from his Tang Soo Do foundation. The champion pressed forward immediately, attempting to capitalize on what should have been a moment of opponent vulnerability. Norris was not vulnerable.
He closed the distance the champion had just created, moving inside the range where Muay Thai's longer-range kicking arsenal became less effective, into the specific tactical space where his own striking background, built on speed, precision, and economical close-range technique, could function at full capacity. A short, controlled combination. 2 strikes, delivered with the precision of a man who had spent his entire competitive career learning exactly how much force a demonstration required versus how much an actual fight demanded, and choosing, even now, the demonstration calibration, because injuring an undefeated professional fighter in what was meant to be a controlled exhibition was never the goal. The strikes landed, clean, unmistakable, audible even over the crowd noise that had by this point shifted entirely from indifferent background chatter to a rising, confused murmur of genuine attention. The champion stepped back. He looked at Chuck Norris. For the first time since the open call began, his expression carried something that 30 years of stadium tradition had never required him to display in this particular ritual: genuine respect, delivered through the universal, unmistakable body language of a serious competitor recognizing a serious opponent.
The referee, present for the open call segment more as a formality than an active arbiter, stepped between them, the standard procedure for ending these brief ceremonial exchanges before they extended any further. The champion raised his gloved hand toward Norris. Not in victory, in acknowledgement. The gesture confused much of the crowd, who had not been tracking the exchange closely enough to understand why the champion was extending this specific, unusual courtesy to a volunteer from the cheap seats, rather than simply moving on to the next portion of the evening as he always did. But the people seated closest to the ring, the ones who had actually watched the full 90 seconds, rather than continuing their conversations through it, understood. They had just witnessed something that the open call tradition had never, in 30 years of stadium history, actually produced: a genuine contest, however brief, between a professional champion and someone who, whatever his name was, clearly was not an ordinary volunteer. Norris climbed out of the ring without ceremony. He returned to his seat in the back section. His noodles, still in their paper container, were cold by the time he sat back down. He finished them anyway. The champion's translator, several years later, gave an account of the evening to a visiting American martial arts journalist who was researching regional Muay Thai history, a chance encounter rather than a planned interview, the translator mentioning the story almost in passing while discussing the stadium's history more broadly. He described the champion's reaction immediately after the exchange, a long silence in the dressing room, the champion sitting quietly for several minutes before saying anything to his corner team. When he finally spoke, according to the translator, he said something that the corner team found genuinely unsettling, given how rarely their champion expressed anything resembling doubt about his own dominance. He said, "That man could have ended it faster. He didn't." Nobody in the dressing room fully understood what he meant by that at the time. The journalist who eventually heard this second-hand account, years later, recognized something in the description that the original witnesses couldn't have. A detail that, once cross-referenced against Chuck Norris's known travel history through Southeast Asia during his championship years, lined up with enough specificity to suggest the story was in fact describing exactly who everyone involved had begun to suspect it was describing. The story never made it into any official record. No stadium kept archives of open-call volunteers. No promotional material referenced an unnamed foreign tourist who had briefly, unexpectedly tested an undefeated champion's full arsenal and walked away having clearly held something back. It survived instead the way the truest martial arts stories always survive, through the specific, persistent oral tradition of people who were there, telling people who weren't, until the story outlived its original undocumented evening by decades. The champion continued his career for several more years, eventually retiring with his undefeated record extended even further, by any official account a legend within the specific tradition of Bangkok stadium boxing. He never publicly referenced the open call incident. There was no professional reason to. The stadium's official record showed exactly what it always showed for these informal segments: a brief demonstration, a champion's dominance reaffirmed, the routine business of a pre-fight evening proceeding as expected. But people within his training camp in the years that followed occasionally noted something that outsiders wouldn't have recognized as significant, a specific caution, a specific thoroughness that crept into how he approached the open call tradition going forward. He never again dismissed a volunteer stance in under a second. He started watching more carefully, reading weight distribution, hand position, the small, easily overlooked signals that distinguish a trained fighter wearing plain clothes from an enthusiastic amateur wearing the same. He had learned in 90 unscripted seconds against a man whose name he never knew, something that 30 years of routine victories against actual amateurs had never required him to learn, that appearance and capability are not reliably connected, that the most dangerous person in a room is sometimes the quietest one, sitting in the cheap seats, finishing a meal before raising his hand. Chuck Norris, for his part, never publicly discussed this specific evening in any interview, autobiography, or retrospective account of his training years throughout Asia.
This is in itself entirely consistent with how he approached every similar moment throughout his career: the ball-wall confrontation, the Joe Louis exchange, the countless private tests and demonstrations that occurred throughout decades of serious continuous training. He didn't need the story told. The training itself was the point. The testing itself was the point. Whether anyone outside the room, or in this case outside the stadium's closest rows, ever knew what had happened was never the actual measure of whether the test had been worth taking. He had traveled to Southeast Asia seeking genuine exposure to an unfamiliar striking discipline. He had received exactly that, in the most direct and honest form available: unscripted, full-intensity engagement against one of the finest practitioners the discipline had to offer. He had passed the test, and then he had finished his noodles. A Bangkok stadium, an undefeated champion, a ritual that had never, in 30 years, produced a genuine contest. And a quiet man in a plain gray t-shirt who raised his hand without finishing his bite of food, because the question being asked, could this discipline's intensity be tested honestly, by someone who genuinely wanted to know, was a question worth answering directly. 90 seconds. No knockdown, no dramatic finish, just 2 checked kicks, 1 disrupted clinch, and a short combination delivered with exactly enough force to communicate the truth, without inflicting unnecessary damage on a man who had done nothing wrong except not recognize who he was facing. The champion learned something that night that no amount of routine victories could have taught him. And the quiet man in the back row returned to his cold noodles, having learned something too, about checked kicks, about clinch timing, about exactly how a different tradition's striking mechanics actually felt when thrown at full unscripted intensity by someone who had spent his life mastering them. Both men walked away from that reign having genuinely learned something true. That is perhaps the rarest outcome any confrontation can produce. He was in his early 30s in that stadium. He had already won his first world championship. He would win 5 more. He had traveled across an ocean specifically to find out what he didn't yet know.